Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. This time we're tackling something, well, something that might feel really relevant with Thanksgiving coming up.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
We're looking at the whole intersection of autism and narcissism,
Okay.
especially within families. We've got a bunch of different sources,
Uh-huh.
but Cheap ABA is our main one for this one. And they
Interesting.
got these amazing articles about all the ins and outs of adult autism.
It's funny you should mention Thanksgiving because that's when all these family dynamics, they kind of get amplified,
Ah,
when everyone's together.
really?
Like having these insights from cheap ABA could be so helpful to really understand what might be going on beneath the surface.
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
almost like having a decoder ring for all those tricky family interactions. But
Okay.
okay, before we jump into the whole Thanksgiving thing, let's start with the basics. Autism spectrum disorder. It's not just one set of characteristics, right?
Right? It's a spectrum for a reason. It's this huge range of neurodevelopmental differences
Right.
affecting communication, social interaction, how people behave, all sorts of things. And even within that, you have what's called high masking,
Mm.
where some autistic individuals, they become incredibly skilled at camouflaging their traits.
Wow. High masking. So that sounds like almost like playing a role all the time. I know some of the articles mention that some high masking individuals actually use scripting, like they'll have these pre-planned phrases or reactions for different social situations.
Oh, yeah.
No wonder it's exhausting.
Absolutely. And cheap ABA really goes into the mental and emotional toll it takes. It's not just about trying to fit in, it's this constant effort to navigate a world that doesn't quite line up with how their brain works.
Right. Okay, so we've got this spectrum of autism, and some people are really good at blending in. So then, how does narcissism fit into all this?
Well, we're not really talking about clinical diagnoses here. Think of it more like a cluster of traits: that really intense self-centeredness, the need for admiration all the time, lack of empathy, and then that tendency to manipulate others to get what they want.
And Cheap ABA is saying that these behaviors, they can be especially difficult for people on the autism spectrum to handle.
Exactly. Autistic individuals, especially those who are high masking, they often struggle with things like social cues and emotional regulation, and they can have a hard time setting boundaries too. So when you combine that with the manipulative tactics of a narcissist, you can end up with a really volatile situation, especially within a family.
And this brings us back to Thanksgiving. There's one article, Adult Autism and How Narcissists Act on Thanksgiving. It paints this really vivid picture of these scenarios that probably play out in way more families than we realize.
Right, and it's not just the big blow-ups or anything. Cheap ABA describes these subtle ways narcissists control the whole mood, like constant grandstanding, interrupting other people to talk about themselves, hijacking conversations to steer them back to their own achievements.
It's like they're always playing the lead role
Hmm.
in their own personal drama. And the articles actually give some really specific examples that are almost painfully relatable. Like one of them talks about a narcissist using guilt trips disguised as compliments,
Oh, yeah.
like saying, "Oh, you look so thin. Have you lost weight?" Knowing full well that the person is already struggling with body image.
Those backhanded compliments, they're classic.
Yeah.
And for someone on the autism spectrum, who might already be overwhelmed by just all the sensory stuff at a big gathering, these little interactions, they just add this whole other layer of complexity.
So we're starting to see how these two worlds collide. The autistic individual trying to navigate all these social complexities, and then the narcissist just creating chaos wherever they go. I'd love for you, our listener, to think about your own experiences here. Have you seen similar things happening in your own family? Keep that in mind as we go on because it's about to get really interesting.
Okay, so let's really get into how these scenarios impact someone on the autism spectrum.
Okay?
Cheap ABA really emphasizes how intense sensory overload can get, especially in situations like these big Thanksgiving dinners we've been talking about.
Sensory overload. I feel like that's something a lot of people misunderstand. Can you break that down for us? What does it actually feel like for someone with autism?
Imagine you're in a room and like every conversation is happening at the same volume. All the lights are super bright. Every single smell just hits you full force and you can't tune anything out. It's
Wow.
completely overwhelming, almost like being physically bombarded with stimulation. That's what sensory overload can be like for someone with autism.
So if you're already dealing with the social and emotional challenges of interacting with a narcissist on top of that, that sensory overload must feel just exponentially worse.
Yeah, exactly. The cheap ABA articles describe it as like a perfect storm kind of situation. You're already struggling to process social cues, regulate your emotions, and then you add this sensory assault on top of everything else. It becomes almost impossible to cope.
There's this story in one of the articles that really stuck with me. This woman's describing going to a family gathering, and she says it felt like she was drowning in a sea of sensations.
Oh, wow.
And she actually had to leave the room and find a quiet space just to regain her composure.
And that's where the lack of empathy from those narcissistic family members, it can be so damaging, you know? They might see her leaving and think she's being rude or antisocial, not understanding the internal struggle she's dealing with at all.
It's heartbreaking because she's doing her best to handle a situation
Yeah.
that's incredibly tough for her. So what can be done? What does cheap ABA suggest for dealing with these kinds of dynamics?
Well, they really stress the importance of having strategies in place beforehand.
Yeah.
It's not about changing the narcissist or masking your autistic traits even more. It's about having tools to protect your own well-being.
Like what kinds of tools?
One big one is setting boundaries, both physical and emotional. This might mean limiting your time at these gatherings, having a quiet space you can retreat to, or even just opting out of certain activities or conversations that are too much.
So it's about knowing your limits and advocating for what you need, even in a situation as emotionally charged as a family gathering.
Exactly. The articles also talk a lot about self-care, bringing noise-canceling headphones, having a calming sensory toy, even planning something relaxing to do after the event to help you decompress.
Those are really practical tips. But what about situations where you can't just physically leave, like you're stuck at a dinner table and the narcissist is dominating the conversation?
Right.
What do you do then?
That's where those internal strategies come in. Cheap ABA mentions things like mindfulness techniques, deep breathing exercises, even visualization. These tools can help you regulate those emotions and manage anxiety in the moment.
And I imagine having a good support system is important too. Someone who understands what you're going through and can just offer a listening ear.
Absolutely, a therapist, a support group, a trusted friend. Having that validation and understanding can make a huge difference.
It's so easy to get caught up in trying to fix things. But I love how cheap ABA really focuses on empowerment and self-advocacy. It's not about making the autistic person normal. It's about giving them the tools to thrive in a world that's not always set up for them.
That's such an important point, and it kind of leads into another question that cheap ABA brings up. What about the impact on the people supporting the autistic person?
Oh, that's interesting. We've been focusing so much on the autistic individual's experience. But you're right, there's a whole other layer of complexity there. So we were talking about how these narcissistic behaviors can impact people on the autism spectrum. But like you said, what about the people who are trying to support them?
Yeah, it's something cheap ABA brings up, and it's easy to forget about. Like, imagine you're a parent of a child with autism, and you're trying so hard to create this supportive environment for them at a family get-together. But then you've also got a narcissistic grandparent in the mix who just totally dismisses your kid's needs or uses the whole situation to make it all about them.
It's like you're trying to walk through a minefield. You're supporting your child, but also trying to manage this other difficult personality.
Exactly.
That's got to be exhausting.
It is. Cheap ABA actually talks about the risk of burnout. Not just for the autistic individual, but for their whole support system too. These caregivers, they're constantly walking this tightrope, advocating for their loved one while trying to keep everyone else happy.
So then what can they do? What are some ways they can protect themselves and the person they're caring for?
A lot of the same principles apply, honestly. Setting boundaries, prioritizing your own self-care, and finding support for yourself. But it's also super important to recognize those patterns of narcissistic behavior. Remember, you can't control the narcissist, only how you react to them.
Right, it's about shifting that focus from trying to change the situation to what you can actually control, like your own well-being and the support you're giving to your loved one.
Exactly. It might mean limiting your contact with that person, setting really firm boundaries around certain topics you won't discuss, or even having like a signal with the autistic individual so they can excuse themselves gracefully from a tough interaction.
Those are great tips. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all this?
You know, for me, it really comes down to awareness. By understanding the challenges that autistic individuals face, especially when you add in these narcissistic family dynamics, it allows us to create more supportive and inclusive environments for everyone. It's about moving past judgment and really listening to the experiences of autistic individuals and those who care for them.
I love that. It's like a call to action for all of us to be more informed, more empathetic, and more proactive in building those spaces where everyone feels seen and heard and respected.
It's been a great conversation. As you think more about this, I'll leave you with one question. If you've been focusing on supporting an autistic family member, have you considered how you're being impacted by those narcissistic behaviors? It's something we all need to think about.
Definitely something to consider.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us, everyone, for this deep dive. And we encourage you to check out the resources on Cheap ABA and other sites like it. There's so much great information out there to help you understand and support autistic individuals and their loved ones